up here in Columbus, and obviously we serve a lot of our customers in Ohio, but we're in 11 states, over 5 million customers. And I think probably most pertinent for this discussion is we have over 260,000 miles, sort of mind-boggling to me that we have that many miles of transmission and distribution lines. So needless to say, storms, severe weather, and recovery from those is a huge issue for us. In fact, we're the largest T&D company in the U.S. One other point, and that is the geography is very interesting because I think we're sort of a microcosm of the entire U.S. in terms of weather events. I mean, just in the last 3 to 4 years, we've had a hurricane that hit this area of Texas. We had a huge ice storm in Oklahoma, particularly this part of Oklahoma. We had, as many of you remember, the derecho in 2012 that basically ripped through Indiana, Ohio, and all the way to West Virginia. And thankfully, that day I was flying to New York instead of Washington because it ended up in Washington, D.C. And then we've had major heavy snow events, which are also problematic in addition to ice storms, and that caused a lot of problems in Kentucky and Virginia. So across our service territory, we've sort of had everything that Mother Nature can throw at us. A little additional background on us is our generating system. In addition to being a large T&D company, we're the 3rd largest electric generating company in the United States. When I joined AEP, which is back in 1997, I started there, and AEP was about 90% coal-fired as a utility. So 90% of our generating capacity is coal. You can see from the graphic and a lot of the changes, certainly particularly in the last decade, we have moved to a much greater diversity of generation. In fact, we've gone from 90%, you see in the figure, down to about 60%, 61% today, with a number of coal retirements that we are now planning, which will occur in the next couple of years. About 25% of our coal capacity will be retiring, and that percentage, therefore, is going to drop to around 50%, or about half. Natural gas, where we're adding a lot, energy efficiency, demand response type capacity, as well as a significant amount of wind capacity. Of that 2,000 megawatts of renewables, the vast majority of that is wind, and a lot of that actually is in this part of Texas where the wind blows very frequently. Those of you who have ever been to West Texas know it blows, seems like all the time. Okay, and what that has meant for that reason, certainly as we've diversified, moved away from coal, moved to more natural gas, moved to more non-fossil sources of energy, is our CO2 emissions have declined. And this is combined with the fact that many of you may remember there was something called the Chicago Climate Exchange, and AEP was a founding member of that exchange. Richard Sandor, who some of you know, was one of the leads in that whole endeavor, got it started. And part of that is we had a voluntary commitment to reduce our emissions, most of that during this period all the way out to 2010. You can see some significant reductions. In fact, we're almost have reduced our emissions by 1/3 since 2000. By 2020, I think we'll be down probably close to 40%. Okay. All right, so back to power infrastructure. What are we concerned about? What kind of keeps people up at night, and particularly in our distribution side of our business? Well, clearly the storms, the serious storms that we face, and certainly, you know, a lot of the IPCC reports and others are suggesting that we could see more serious storms, more powerful storms. But I got to tell you, we're already worried about what we have today. And clearly in the last couple of years, we've had some events that were quite unusual. The derecho was sort of a once-in-a-100-year kind of event, and everyone, of course, knows about Hurricane Sandy. Fortunately, that did not affect AEP very much, but it certainly affected a lot of other utilities and much of the East Coast. The other areas that we are concerned about equally as much, unfortunately, these days, and I'm not going to be talking about it because they're not climate related, but they are related, unfortunately, to a post-9/11 world, is cyber threats and physical security. It's really sad that we have to worry about those, but we do, and we have to pay a lot of attention to them as well. The responses, tree trimming and right-of-way maintenance. Not very popular, tree trimming. Certainly know that living in Upper Arlington and sort of dreading when the trucks come by, what are they going to do to our trees? But the reality is that maintenance is probably the most important thing for keeping the grid reliable and also resilient for recovery. Hardening activities, I'll talk about some of those in a little while, but a lot of them relate to improving the materials of the grid, both the wires, the circuits, as well as the poles. And then resiliency, and equally important to reliability and avoiding outages in the first place, or limiting the damages associated with a storm event, is the ability to recover from that event and to limit the problems associated with the outages and the extent of the outages. And that's what we refer to as resiliency. One key part of that is the smart grid, or we call gridSMART here in Ohio, which is something that I think is extremely important as we move forward. Okay, so what are some of the event types? AEP has a distribution. People have been tracking storms and events for many years, and it's just a matter of classifications that they've used. We use winds above 60 miles an hour. There's no magic in that number. Some people say 70, some say 50, but that's the way we've been classifying them historically. It does happen, of course, that all the tropical storms and Category 1 hurricanes and above, obviously, would fit into that above 60 mile an hour category. And of course, in addition to those, you have straight line winds, which can be even worse. The derecho was far worse than tropical storms for us in terms of the damage. Downbursts that you get from thunderstorms, or obviously tornadoes as well. Equally as problematic, you notice I mentioned 4 events, and 2 of them were ice and snow events. Ice on lines is a big problem. Ice on trees near lines is an even bigger problem. And that's where you get a lot of outages from some of these storms, and you can see sort of graphically what that can do, literally twisting poles and lines and trees and everything else. Okay. What's the current reality of all this? Well, the current reality is that we're in a world where we have, over the last 30 years, become far more efficient in our use of electricity for energy purposes, but we're now using electricity for far more purposes than we ever have before. Obviously, the whole computer age and all the mobile devices has created a concern anytime the power goes off. So there are higher expectations, and we know that. We have higher expectations of ourselves to kind of continue to try and improve reliability and limit the duration of outages. Both of those are very important. The other issue, obviously, is we've had very recent high damage, high profile storms. I mentioned the derecho and Hurricane Sandy, both kind of once in a 100-year type events. Both happened in 2012. Needless to say, that raised a lot of attention, and as I mentioned down here, a lot of regulatory and political scrutiny. The numbers associated with this are pretty mind-boggling. Recovery is bad enough. Just for our restoration costs, we were looking at $73 million in capital, $286 million in O&M during that 3-year period. Obviously, in 2012, derecho was a big, big part of that number. But even worse than that is the fact that there is a huge cost when you lose electricity. So avoiding those events in the first place, and more importantly, limiting the duration of those outages is very, very significant. There are a lot of ways to estimate this. I'm not sure this is the perfect estimate, but the point here is that 34 billion, or if it's 25 billion, still is a lot of money. Now, what's changed and what's kind of interesting is that if I were giving the same speech 20 years ago, I wouldn't be able to talk to you about the smart grid or a lot of the new technologies, a lot of the new materials that are available in hardening the grid. And so we've had a sort of a sea change in those areas, let alone the last 20 years, in the last 10 years. There's been a whole series of responses. They were really heavily driven by Hurricane Sandy. Our CEO, Nick Aiken's very active in this, actually took a leadership role in developing something. First, this Super Sandy evaluation. One of the things that happened after Superstorm Sandy is typically utilities share resources across state lines and among utilities when there is a big weather event. They have something called mutual assistant networks that have been around for many, many years. During Superstorm Sandy, the event was so severe, we actually had 65,000 workers come into that area from across the U.S. and Canada to aid in recovery. So pretty mind-boggling numbers. Well, one of the things that happened, a lot of lessons learned, was there were huge impediments of getting the people there, logistics, you can imagine, fuel supply, that was kind of well publicized for customers in those areas, but you can imagine for utility trucks and other things you wanted to move around, you started losing fuel, that was a big problem. So there was a big lessons learned effort. Out of that, a couple of things happened. One was to develop a new national response event framework. Again, Nick was one of the leaders in that among the CEOs and some of the senior managers. That was to supplement these mutual assistant networks, of which there are 9 across the country. That number actually was reduced to 7 because the Northeast actually had 3 networks, and they ended up getting too much in each other's way in terms of coordination, and it was determined that actually it was better just to have 1. AEP has been doing its own work, our own storm preparedness strategy team, and a lot of advances. Again, a lot in the management side. Crisis management is a lot about individual people knowing where to go and what to do. And it's really as simple as that. And you would be amazed, or maybe not amazed, how often you get certain situations, people didn't anticipate it, and no one knows where to go and what to do. Or they may try and do too much, which is probably equally as problematic. We also developed a new one-voice communication. Some of you may have seen this, if you've had a recent outage, where you actually can get sort of real-time information directly from the web, so that if your electricity's out and you have a handheld device, you can still get that information. And then a lot of that same information is given out to the TV stations, the media, and the others, so people have a better idea, better communication about when they might get service back. Okay, so what do we do about reliability? What are some of the main things that you want to do? Well, I obviously alluded to the first one. I love it how our distribution guys like to call this cyclic vegetation management program. And I like tree trimming. It's a little bit more descriptive. But that's what it is. It's really, for the most part, tree trimming. Notice it says in all locations. The location you don't do, that's the one where you'll get the outage. So you really have to do it everywhere. And you've got to do it, as it says, cyclic, so you've got to do it regularly. You can't let it lapse. And there's real documented evidence of improvements. I'll show you some of the data in AEP Ohio in just a second. The second part of this gets into more of what I call more broader hardening activities. And that's literally inspecting the circuits, the poles, the wires, the material and equipment. And in the past, again, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you did this visually. But today, we got all sorts of great things like remote sensing and EMF detection, as well as infrared inspection methods. And actually, there's a great heat signature when wire is corroding. It gives off a bigger heat signature, so you know that's the time to replace old wire, for example. There's something called sectionalizing improvement. That's really as simple as thinking about it this way, that one circuit may serve, say, 3 neighborhoods. And if something trips that circuit off, the circuit breaker goes, all the neighborhoods black out. Well, if you sectionalize it, or even put in redundancy, in some cases you can even put in redundancy, you could have 3 circuits serve 3 neighborhoods. And then if one of those circuits goes out, it only affects 1 neighborhood as opposed to 3. So that's kind of the idea there. Then you have pole inspection, sort of similar to some things I mentioned up here. Certainly you're targeting the older poles. New materials with poles again. Obviously 30 years ago, virtually other than the transmission towers, everything was wood poles. Increasingly now you've got new fiberglass and steel and other kind of components that work better in some situations. And then replacement of small wire. In the past, some of the older wire is not as heavy gauge. You can get more heavy gauge wire overall, which is better for resiliency. Okay, so here's some data on AEP Ohio. Since 2009, where we were not doing very well in the reliability count and the number of interruptions that we had, and the state in Ohio keeps track of that for all the utilities, we got engaged in a very, very aggressive $1.2 billion program to improve it. $310 million of that was, and frankly the biggest bang for the buck, came from this aggressive vegetation management program. Some of this obviously in transmission, distribution, and you can see the figures. With 4,000 interruptions by trees back in 2009 down to close to 1,000 today, so a lot better. Okay, hardening versus resiliency, what do I mean by those terms? Hardening is really a term, and this is an EEI sort of definition, but it's a term of sort of improving the durability to, in effect, withstand the damage that you have with a severe storm that would result such that you'd have minimal damage and hopefully the equipment would stay in service. So that's pretty straightforward. Resiliency is a little different. You're not really trying to prevent the damage. You're rather trying to allow some portion of those facilities to continue operating, or, and I think, or, more importantly, promote a rapid return to normal operation. So speed of recovery is very, very important on the resiliency front. And the important thing here is there's a trade-off between reliability and resiliency. One of the reactions on Hurricane Sandy that you heard from some people was, gee, why don't we just underground all the wire? Look at all this damage, we should have everything underground. Well, what was interesting was in Hurricane Sandy, had you had that situation, it would have been worse because it flooded, seawater got in. The reason you had most of Manhattan out and not having electricity, including my daughter who lived in Lower Manhattan, had to go to Upper Manhattan and stay with friends, was because the seawater got in and corroded the wires. And then the problem was, when you had that, it was very difficult to repair. Stuff is underground, it's not visible, it's hard to find, what's corroded, where to replace it, et cetera, et cetera. So there was definitely a trade-off between hardening and resiliency. Obviously, there's a big cost difference, too, on what you do on the hardening side versus the resiliency side. So they don't necessarily, the notion that you can get to 100% reliability is really a sort of a flawed notion. The numbers are over 99% today in most electric systems. And obviously, you want to strive to keep improving that number, but you're never going to get to 100% reliability. Okay, what are the hardening activities? I obviously just alluded to some of those. The first thing, obviously, is when you do hardening, you're targeting the specific circuits that are going to give you sort of the most bang for your buck. And that really is a simple notion of you're going to be focusing on areas where you've got the most customers served. So I'm sorry if you live in a rural area and you're the one person that's on a long line. Those are the people who are going to get the last efforts for hardening because they're only a single customer, only a few customers. You ascertain which actions produce the most benefit. As I mentioned, the biggest bang for the buck is this is all part of tree trimming, also other activities you do to widen rights of way. And you can see the cost, $2,000 to $30,000 a mile. You go to the opposite, and hardening upgrades, some of the replacements of poles and circuits and things like that with new materials. That's a little bit higher, $50,000. The big ones, though, undergrounding is $1 million a mile. So obviously, yes, there may be some situations where you want to underground things, and there are some that do make sense, and clearly does make sense that New York City does have its wires underground. It would be pretty difficult to have it any other way. But it doesn't obviously always make sense to move that direction. The other part, as I've been mentioning, is resiliency planning. And when we talk about resiliency planning, there are a lot of aspects of that, and obviously resiliency technology. What we've looked at, and a lot of utilities have looked at, is trying to design the distribution system strategically. Now, that's not so easy as it sounds because it's already there, and it's hard to redesign a system. But keep in mind that there are parts of the system that grow, new housing developments, new areas that crop up, and those give you the opportunities to redesign, establish a better circuitry, if you will, more redundancy in the systems, and the ability to be a little more resilient. The other thing that is important is you've got supervisory control and data acquisition systems, or SCADA, and that really allows you a better opportunity to do remote monitoring, get control of the physical grid system. I already talked a little bit about sectionalizing circuits, and I'm going to show a little video here in just a minute on something called DACR, or DACR, which is Distributed Automated Circuit Reconfiguration. And the best way I can describe that is to show you the video, so we'll do that in just a second. And then the other broad area is expanding the smart meter deployment. With the gridSMART efforts that AEP has, smart meters is probably the most key part of that. And there are a lot of benefits of smart meters. Some of them simply relate to giving customers more information. Obviously, it's automatic meter reading. So in effect, it's a cheaper way to get the bill to the customer, if you will, than it existed in the past. But it also gives the customer information on a regular basis of his own energy usage. And one of the things that studies have shown is when customers actually know on a regular basis how they're using energy and how much energy they're using, their usage drops. Always. And it can be pretty significant, 5–10% in some studies. So that's an important part of it as well. But in addition to that, the smart meters play a very important role in the reliability and resiliency of the system. They improve the speed of outage notification, precision of location extent of outages, and helps determine the status of restoration. And that's what this little DVD is going to show. And the video is actually from our Public Service Oklahoma subsidiary in Oklahoma, but it really would apply here in Ohio or anywhere in our system that starts to develop the smart grid and uses smart grid technologies. And hopefully it will. You ready? Yeah, I am ready.
And minimize the impacts of certain power outages. When service is interrupted, a smart meter relays a signal to PSO indicating it no longer is receiving power. An advanced communication system then checks in with various equipment components along the way to pinpoint both the equipment involved in the interruption and its exact location. At the same time, power flow through the circuit may be automatically redirected, so service may be restored in seconds rather than minutes or even hours to some customers. Where they can be installed, new technologies can limit the number of customers affected by an outage by automatically reconfiguring the circuit. Technologies may reduce outage time by providing information about the location and equipment involved, so crews arrive on site with more information about the work to be completed. With this information, the crew drives directly to that location, often knowing before arrival what the cause is likely to be and what tools and equipment are required to restore service. Fewer or shorter interruptions and better response to them can greatly improve the overall customer experience.
Okay, so the one thing out of that video, which I think is important to take away, is that it obviously, hopefully you saw how you had a large area that was blacked out, and then, and actually it shows in like an hour, it gets service back to most of the areas, and there's only a small area that's blacked out. In reality, I think partly, people at AEP are always afraid to overpromise and have customers angry at them, but the reality is that I think it's more instantaneous in many cases with a well-functioning smart grid. So there'd be initially an outage, and then a lot of people's power would come back on within minutes as opposed to within an hour or so. And that whole thing was showing how this distributed automated circuit reconfiguration works. So the smart meters are kind of telling you where the power is out. They're telling you kind of by a lot of the readings, not just the electric flows, but voltage flows and a variety of other things, the extent of the damage, and automatically then lets the system reconfigure itself. So I always find that kind of neat and kind of high tech. Okay, so we've been at smart grid deployment for a little while. We started in Indiana, Michigan Power. It's a very small pilot, only 10,000 smart meters, a bunch of different technologies. I'm not going to try and explain all of these technologies. I would need another half hour to do that. But suffice to say, I think the most important ones in the smart grid are the smart meter itself and the distribution automated system that I just showed you, and something else called volt-var optimization. And volt-var optimization is a system that, again, will take a little while to understand what it does, and certainly you'd need a little electrical background to understand it. But suffice to say that what it does is gives the customer the same service for electricity that they have before, but saves anywhere from 2 to 4% of the energy across the system. So it's a pretty significant thing. If you think of 2 to 4% across the system, that doesn't sound like a lot, then you realize that the total of all the demand side programs that we've been doing in Ohio are in that same range. So it is a pretty significant savings of electricity. And then from Indiana and Michigan, we went to Public Service Oklahoma and Texas, where we did a 4-year deployment. In 2009, we started in Ohio. Some people in this room may actually have that in the pilot program. It was 110,000 smart meters. That's AMI, is automated metering infrastructure, another fancy term for a smart meter. And you can see with that we did 70 plus circuits with the distribution automated and volt-var optimization. We also did a whole bunch of other things, programmable thermostats, something called direct load control, grid-friendly appliances, even hookups for plug-in electric vehicles in a few cases, energy storage for communities, time of use pricing, real-time pricing, so a whole panoply of things, a very broad set of smart meter kind of techniques. Now, what we learned from that is what we've now filed and have in front of the commission. Of course, these projects all cost money, and so there's an upfront cost. In the long run, there's a lot of benefit, a lot of economic benefit for the customer, but in the short run, it does cost something. So we have this file before the commission. This would deploy the smart grid to 31 communities. Mostly it's going to be the urban and suburban areas. Once again, not many rural communities. The cost effectiveness of doing it in rural communities, given there are very few customers, is not as good. It's a 4-year deployment. It'll build on proven technologies from the phase 1 deployment. And what we're looking at is almost 900,000, actually a little more than 900,000 smart meters, 250 circuits of distribution automation. So think of 250 of those neighborhoods, if you will. If you saw blacked out, those would be the circuits that would be able to reconfigure. 80 circuits for volt-var optimization. And of course, the benefits they talked about: enhanced reliability, quicker identification of outages, cost reductions, faster restoration, and the like, energy efficiency, 2 to 3% reduction in energy use and demand, and of course all that means environmental benefits as well. So with that said, I'm just going to see if there are any questions at this point. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Yep.
Hi, thank you very much. We've had a great workshop today about helping us understand climate change and risk and how to mitigate it. That it's all brought about by man-made caused CO2. I believe, however, AEP recently came out to support SB 310, which is going to freeze the Ohio energy standards and renewables that we have had on the books for a few years. Can you explain why AEP has now come behind it?
Well, I can do my best. I think that we look at public policy on climate and on issues of reducing CO2 emissions as a more broad set of options to do that. AEP is going to be subject to a series of EPA regulations coming up within, well, they'll be proposed within about a month. And so we view that one should have a method of choosing what's the most cost-effective way to get there. Now that could be with energy efficiency and more energy efficiency in the programs. It could be with more renewables, but also could be with more natural gas and greater use of natural gas or greater use of either nuclear technology, although no one's really seriously talking about a nuclear plant here in Ohio. So I think that's really the basis of the position, and part of it also relates to the fact that the standards that were required for energy efficiency, we've done very well with those. We're now at the point where those will ramp up pretty rapidly. And the problem is that you're starting to run out of cost-effective measures. Most of the energy efficiency measures that are cost-effective by any kind of test that you would anticipate are lighting efficiency standards. And those are good, and we've been doing a lot of those. Most of the programs are around the country are oriented towards those. However, one of the things that's going to happen is we will have national standards for lighting that will affect everybody in terms of the light bulbs that they get. We will have compact fluorescents basically replacing incandescent bulbs. And so the incremental improvement that you can get with an energy efficiency program drops off a lot over time. So those are some of the reasons the way we look at it overall.
Well, thank you. And I am an all-electric customer, one of the first smart grid people, taking advantage of 4 of the AEP rebates
Good,
that
good.
have been out there offered. But I would really, really like to see AEP. You didn't mention anything that solar, wind, more of the renewable, clean energy, not nuclear, not gas. Thank you very much.
One additional question. Yep.
Well, you mentioned a lot about storms.
Right.
Given the projections for lots of these prolonged heat events, is the current system prepared for that? Should we experience more prolonged outages?
Well, no, I think that the reliability issue that you have in the electric system is virtually always due to the distribution side of the system, and in some cases the transmission side of the system. It's not a situation where you run out of power. There are some situations that we've had, actually the polar vortex was one of them, where it gets very, very tight and then prices go sky high. And obviously you want to avoid those events if you can. Now a lot of that had to do less with the event itself and more with the way the marketplace was set up, which is something that AEP is trying to get reformed in PJM, which is our broader electricity market that we bid power into. So yes, in the future we'll have climate change, which means we're going to have more hot summer days and maybe higher peaks than we've had historically. But the system does adapt over time to that and has historically with some of the weather events. The bigger issue is you've got to have a system in place that incents people to have real capacity, real plants available. And we don't really have a very good system in place now for that, and we're running into some tightness and problems because of that.
Thank you, Bruce.
Okay, thanks.
A few quick announcements. If you weren't here this morning, there are bio sketches for all the presenters at the